Alright friends, so in this particular video, you are going to be so happy to know that we're going to talk about yet another acronym. Because as you know, in networking, we absolutely love our acronyms. Now this one here happens to be FHRP. Now what we're actually talking about here are first hop redundancy protocols. And this part here really gives you a clue as to what we're talking about, redundancy. We know that this is a very important concept within networking because we know that networking devices fail, we know that links happen to fail, and we don't want the network to be reliant upon a single device or a single path, because if that happens and the primary path, the only path should I say, happens to fail, then you cannot traverse that particular network. Whereas if we happen to have redundancy, even if that primary path happens to fail or that primary device happens to fail, we don't have quite the same impact. Now the next part about this acronym first hop, what are we talking about here? Well, really we're talking about what is going to be effectively our default gateway. It's going to be the first hop we use in order to escape our local network. Now, what I want to do is just briefly turn your attention to this little topology on the left here. Why? Well, because quite simply, this is the topology we're going to be using in order to demonstrate this technology. Now, here's the thing. What do we actually have here? Well, we actually have 4 switches, but more specifically, because these are nice new Aruba switches, they happen to be L3 compatible. They're layer 3 switches, meaning that each device here can ultimately perform routing. So the first thing that I should just state here is that in this particular topology, there is absolutely no need, no use for a first hop redundancy protocol. Why do I say that? Well, think about it like this. We have our end device connecting directly to a layer 3 compatible device. This is our layer 3 switch. So what is our default gateway going to be? Well, we connect directly to this device. Therefore, this one here is going to be our default gateway. Makes sense? However, what I would like you to do is to maybe pretend that this particular device is not a new device. Let's say it's an older layer 2 switch, because by the way, in the real world, this is not an uncommon scenario. There are tons and tons of networks with really old devices still running in them. Quite simply, not everyone is wanting to spend the money to upgrade their systems to get these nice new Aruba switches, okay? So we have to work with what we have. Now imagine, like I say, this is layer 2 switching. So it's an older Aruba switch, or maybe an older Cisco switch, an older Juniper switch, that type of thing. It's in your network though, and this is a device that you here on your end station are directly connecting into. Now, if I asked you, where would your default gateway actually be? Well, quite honestly, we don't actually know that yet, but one thing we absolutely do know is that the default gateway cannot be this particular device, because this device here, as a layer 2 switch, is not capable of routing traffic out of the local network, so it can't be that default gateway. Therefore, maybe these switches upstream right here, if they're layer 3 compatible, then one of them could be the candidate for that particular role. So again, let's imagine our topology from this point on actually is fully accurate. So essentially we have a layer 3 switch, and a layer 3 switch. Basically, all of these devices can perform routing functions. So given that information, what is our default gateway going to be? Well, it could be effectively this particular switch here, or it could be this particular switch, meaning that this could all be one big network right here. And if we here want to maybe go to an external network, such as the device up here, our first layer 3 hop would be going this way, or potentially going that way. Now, where on earth am I going with this, okay? Well, given the fact we're talking about redundancy, maybe you can guess. Let's say that we happen to choose this particular switch right here, okay? So if this device here wants to talk to the network up here, we effectively go through this particular default gateway, and that can route the traffic to external networks. And perhaps days, weeks, months go by, everything is a-okay. However, what if we happen to have a problem on this particular link right here, and it severs our ability to communicate with this default gateway? Or alternatively, what if this device just happens to flat out fail? We once again cannot actually route traffic out of this particular device to the external network. What we would then have to do is notice for a start that we cannot route that traffic, and then perhaps go into this particular device and then manually configure the default gateway to be this particular switch right here. And then what would happen is we could then put that traffic through the layer 2 device up to the default gateway, and once again we could route that traffic to the endpoint destination. So we can see here we do actually have some type of other option. If one fails, we go the opposite direction, and a similar way, if this one fails, we can go this direction. But the intervention needed here, i.e. the manual configuration or reconfiguration on this particular switch, or rather this particular end device, is not efficient, okay? Wouldn't it be a lot better if we could just kind of specify the IP addresses of both of these devices here and use those as the default gateway, almost like having two separate IP addresses as our default gateway? So basically, if this device wants to talk to the external network, we can send the traffic to here, but if it fails, we automatically just try this particular path, because ultimately we've got two ways out of the network. Now, what I just described is kind of like first hop redundancy protocols. The big distinction though is, as opposed to going into our end device and giving two IP addresses, the IP address of this default gateway and the IP address of this one right here, instead we're going to link these two devices together by creating a virtual IP address that both of them share. So we just have one IP address, i.e. one default gateway that we configure on here, which will be the virtual IP address of both of these two devices. And these two devices can ultimately communicate with one another, as we can see right here. And the type of communication they're going to say is that, hey, we both have this virtual IP address that we're sharing, but only one of us is going to respond to requests for that particular IP address, i.e. if we happen to ARP for the IP address of the default gateway, this one here can be designated what is known as the master in the configuration, whereas this one here can be the backup or the standby device. So basically, whilst this master one is up and running, anytime this switch here wants to make a connection by connecting to the default gateway, this one is going to handle the request. Now the cool thing happens to be is that throughout the connection, these two devices are continually talking to one another. Now for whatever reason, if say for example the backup one right here stops hearing information from the master one, i.e. the master one is now broken, or say for example the connection has severed, then the device that was acting as the backup is suddenly going to reconfigure itself as now the master device in that connection, and this is the one that's going to be responding to any ARP requests and handling any of the traffic. So now effectively we can shuttle the traffic automatically via this node. Now this whole process of these devices here sharing a virtual IP address, having different roles such as a master role and a backup role, this is all handled via the first hop redundancy protocol. And this right here is exactly what we want to focus in on in this particular skill. Now, the first hop redundancy protocol, this is not the name of the protocol itself. This is the acronym used to describe different protocols that do this particular function. Now, other vendors such as Cisco have a particular implementation known as FHRP. This is the hot standby routing protocol, and basically this is used on Cisco specific devices. Now, because we happen to be using Aruba devices, we obviously cannot implement HSRP. However, there was an open standard created known as VRRP, the Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol. Now, this actually is the open standard protocol that we can use across multiple different vendors. It can be supported by Aruba switches, Juniper switches, even Cisco devices too. And it is this particular protocol that we are going to be focused in on in this particular skill.